Good afternoon. Welcome. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd like to just acknowledge a few institutions and individuals that helped to make this possible. This is a part of the South Asia Studies Colloquium series. So first of all, thanks to the Department of Anthropology and my colleague Radhika Govindarajan for facilitating a co-sponsorship with anthropology. And I know a lot of you are in her class and will be leaving en masse at 4:30, and that is perfectly fine because you'll be here for the important part, which is the talk. Secondly, thanks to my colleagues in the Nepal Studies Initiative. This talk falls under the auspices of that initiative, which is about a 5-year-old program to sort of create a dynamic node around the study of Nepal on campus, and they've succeeded really wildly in that. So David Citron and Scott Halliday and Hassan Sharpa have all been closely affiliated with that, and thanks to them for their help with this. And let me just take this opportunity to announce that in July, the first half of July 2020, the South Asia Center and the Nepal Studies Initiative are offering a 2-week intensive Nepali class here in Seattle. So look for more details maybe next week about that. That's a non-credit class, and we're just asking for a participation fee or registration fee. So we're hoping it will be as affordable as possible to both students as well as people off campus. So in the South Asia Center, thanks to Michael Wallstrom and Shelby House for their help with logistics and the publicity for this event. And I'll also take this chance to introduce you to our newest staff member in the South Asia Center, Nick Gottschalk, who's all the way in the back. He's just joined earlier this week as the managing director of the South Asia Center. So my name is Sunil Akale, in case I forgot to mention that, and I'm the director of the center. Thanks for being here. Okay, our speaker today is Professor Lauren Leve, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's an anthropologist by training, and her research is concerned primarily with the cultural dynamics of globalization, the relations between political and economic liberalization, ethical personhood, and religious change, many of which themes you'll see reflected in the talk today. She's the author of the book, The Buddhist Art of Living in Nepal, Ethical Practice and Religious Reform, which was published by Routledge in 2016 and recipient of the James Fisher Book Prize from the Association of Nepal and Himalayan Studies. She's also published a number of peer-reviewed articles and essays on a range of topics, including identity, democracy, secularism, development, gender, and Buddhism in Nepal. Professor Leve is currently engaged in several new research projects. The first, about which we'll be hearing more today, traces the unexpected overlaps between women's empowerment, international development, and Maoist civil war in the context of the rise of evangelical Christianity in the once Hindu kingdom, now secular Republic of Nepal. A second project explores the globalization of Vipassana, or mindfulness meditation, which is a project that raises questions about capitalism, secularism, and modernist Buddhism's universalizing claims. So please join me in welcoming Professor Leve.
Thank you, everyone. It's really exciting to see so many people here, to see so much interest in Nepal. And I'm particularly grateful for all of you for coming out at this time of the semester, which I know is really tight. So I'm very excited for this opportunity and to engage with you all and the time that you've created to make that happen. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so I was standing up because if I sit down, it's going to be even worse. But if I drop into the paper or just my voice drops, please gesture wildly. Do whatever you have to do to make me see you. Can you hear me now? Is it better now? Okay. So the thoughts that I'm presenting today are drawn from an ongoing project, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. An ongoing project focused on gendered experiences of liberalization in Nepal and the ways that Nepali women in particular have been making lives within and alongside neoliberalism and violence, including by converting to Christianity. I've changed my title slightly, as you see above, to Christian Women, Ethical Practices of Care, Engaging the Moral Immoral Nepal State. I want to begin with a short video clip taken in a one-room Christian church on the outskirts of Gorkha Bazaar, Nepal. Gorkha, a rural district that lies about 6 hours from Kathmandu by road, has been represented as the sacred heart of nationalist Nepal. And indeed, the church in this video lies less than 3 miles from the palace from which the much celebrated first king of Nepal, Prithvinarayan Shah, set out in the late 17th century to conquer, or as it's more commonly written, unite, the neighboring Himalayan principalities that now make up the country, a land that, as Sunila said, is now a Republican nation-state, but which was until 2008 a Hindu kingdom. The Peace Tree Church, as I call it, is led by Chandika, a woman I met about 25 years ago while evaluating the long-term effects of a rural women's literacy class. Chandika converted from Hinduism to Christianity about 20 years ago while living in Kathmandu, to which she fled from her village during the Maoist-led People's War that divided the country between 1996 and 2006. She's since returned to Gorkha in 2008, 2 years after hostilities ended, and started a prayer group that has grown into a church that attracts people of all ages and ethnicities. The 100 or so new Christians who gather at this church every Saturday and who meet for various other prayer programs and different kinds of events at the church or in personal homes almost every day in between are part of the fastest growing and also most contested religious movement in Nepal. So let's see. No.
Yes?
Yes, except that I don't see my cursor. Oh, it was so smooth for a minute there, technically. Here we go.
You got it?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So here's the video. I apologize. This is my first attempt at videography, and I didn't really understand what you could or couldn't do, but it's what I've got, so we're going to work with that. Let's see, I'll just move it along a little bit. Oops. So, as you saw, or take my word for it, the people in that video are praying to the Christian God who they call Parmeswar. And what I hope you were also able to perceive, and I have a hard time watching that, especially at the end without getting sort of moved, is the intensity of the affect that accompanies Christian prayer. In fact, this is just one of several moments in every service where people speak directly to God, thanking Him, praising Him, and voicing the contents of their hearts. The larger project on which this presentation is based draws on ethnographic research with a group of Gorkhali women that began in the early 90s when they completed an NGO-led rural literacy course, lasted through the late 90s and early 2000s when many of these women were avid Maoists, and continues today when many of them are, notably, converting from Hinduism to Protestant Christianity. In so doing, they're becoming part of an emergent Christian public that, because of its remarkable rate of growth, has led foreign missionary organizations to celebrate Nepal. There's a chair there. Sorry. As one of the Celebrate Nepal is one of the fastest growing churches in the world. Indeed, there were no more than 500 Christians in the country in 1973, according to missionary tallies, compared to at least 1 million now, and some church leaders estimate up to 2 million or more. But what is the appeal of this Christian God? What is it about Christianity that's calling so many people to abandon gods they were born to in order to devote themselves to a new deity? What might Gorkhali women's attachment to the Christian God tell us about women's struggles and their agency in Nepal more broadly? And how might they help us better understand the complex interproductions, subjectivities, and affects that connect morality, the state, gender, and citizenship? So part one, I've divided the talk into parts: Christianity in a formerly Hindu nation. To fully understand the dynamics of Christianity in Nepal, it's necessary to begin with some basic information about the role of religion in the country's colonial and post-colonial histories and the ways that this has shaped Christian trajectories. Since its founding over 200 years ago, Nepal's fashioned itself as a Hindu kingdom. And you can see here the seal of Nepal with the king's hat and the Nepali flags, and then the protected cow wandering happily down below. Hinduism has been bound up with nationalist discourses of identity as such in ways that cast Christians as outsiders. Indeed, school children learn Prithvi Narayan himself is said to have credited his military victories to the favor of a powerful local goddess, and to have spoken of his kingdom as Asal Hindustan, or a pure Hindu realm, to secure which he expelled the small Capuchin mission in Kathmandu immediately upon taking the city. In later years, his descendants would cite the country's putative Hindu identity in correspondence with the British Raj in their attempt to keep foreign goods and people from entering the land, claiming that the pious Hindu populace would simply not tolerate a contaminating foreign presence and would surely overthrow the government itself. And again, for most of the 20th century, his great-great-great-great, etc. Grandsons used religious rhetoric to promote a popular nationalism centered on the Hindu king and Nepal's unique identity as the world's only Hindu nation. In 1990, a popular movement, Jan Andolan won multi-party democracy and formal acknowledgement of the country's multi-ethnic, multilingual social reality. But even then, the new constitution maintained laws requiring the king to be a Hindu and forbidding his subjects to depart from their ancestral religion or to cause others to do so, i.e. to proselytize or to convert, arguing that to allow religious diversity would presage the end of the unified nation. The result of this Hindu imaginary and accompanying laws, which were enforced through expulsions, imprisonments, and fines, was to limit the presence of Christians into the 20th century. However, beginning in the 1960s, Protestant missionary organizations were allowed into the country to operate medical facilities and later deliver other kinds of development, which, importantly for this story, was portrayed as a gift from a caring king to his subjects. But these missionaries were expressly forbidden to preach or carry out conversions, so anything that they did in terms of missionary activities was small and had to be underground. This changed after 1990, when the newly democratized political climate inspired Nepali Christians then living in India to return to Nepal, where they still operated underground, but increasingly in the open. The insurrection civil war, again 1996 to 2006, lent support to their missionary activities as people fled their villages for the safety and opportunity of major cities, and as state control broke down across the country. And by the end of the war, it was said that over 2/3 of the country's 75 districts were in fact controlled by Maoists. In fact, Gorkha was one of the first rebel strongholds where the Maoist promise of justice to oppressed and marginalized groups and development for everyone resonated with people who had only felt their historical suffering increase as a result of the aggressive economic liberalization policies that came into force along with political democracy in 1990, privatizing essential services, including healthcare and education, and allowing the prices of basic goods to rise, so rice, sugar, kerosene, the things that people need every day, as government protections and price regulation was rolled back, making consumer costs subject to market forces. Between 1990 and 1999, missionary records suggest that the number of baptized Christians, which is not the same as the number of practicing Christians, of course, grew from 50,000 to 400,000. although they remained largely invisible to the urban elite. But in 2006, the Maoists reached an agreement with the mainstream political parties and agreed to lay down their arms and join the political process, so this was John Underland too, in return for the establishment of Republican democracy. This would be Loktantra, the rule of the people, as opposed to Prajatantra. Praja sort of is people in the sense of subjects, which is the way that democracy post-1990 was described. Elections were held for constituent assembly that would bring democracy and development to all of Nepal. And in 2008, the second legislative act of the first post-Civil War Nepali government, after formally abolishing the monarchy, was to legally declare the country a secular state. The years since then have mainly brought disappointment of those dreams, at least from the perspective of Gorkhali Christian women. Ooh, I'm gonna slide off. You should have been looking at the Maoists while I was telling you some of this. So here's the Maoists. We're gonna move on. Okay, so the years since then have mainly brought disappointment of these dreams, at least from the perspective of the Gorkhali Christians that I worked with. Party infighting delayed the new constitution for 7 years until 2015. So this is the world of the new Nepal that Amanda Snellinger wrote about, for any of you who know her, leaving the citizenry in an extended state of insecurity. Unemployment is a huge problem as war decimated rural economies have basically given up and died, forcing young men and increasingly young women as well to seek wage labor abroad. Near the Peace Tree Church, almost every household has at least one family member in the Gulf, Korea, or Malaysia, and several households are without any young men at all. And this is actually a picture that I took from the place that Chandika, the pastor, sort of stood and said, look out there, there isn't a single house there that doesn't have somebody who's working abroad, most of them in the Gulf. So in addition, promised reconciliation processes after the war have failed to take place, with no one being held accountable for wartime atrocities so far. And the affluence that people expected remains largely on hold or inaccessible to those who are not part of an English-educated urban elite, even as the liberalization policies that I mentioned earlier have continued to inflate the cost of living. Despite or perhaps because of this, however, Christianity has grown and become increasingly visible. Free to evangelize openly now, foreign missionaries have rushed to set up shop in Kathmandu, where their numbers and the coffee shops that they increasingly seem to run have made them very visible. My own impression is that these foreigners are much less responsible for Christian growth than either they or their Hindu nationalist critics claim, but the number of Christians is undoubtedly coming to grow, and they're showing themselves publicly without fear. And here there's a rally in Kathmandu, and you can see this is about 4 houses down from the Peaceful Gathering Church, Peace Tree Church, and you can see that they've inscribed a cross. I think you can see that they've inscribed a cross on the house. For the Hindu political elite, this is an existential threat to the nation itself. Levying arguments that will be familiar to anyone here who works in India, they claim that Christianity is a foreign religion and an imperial force that preys on Nepal's most vulnerable, exploiting their poverty by promising money, food, and jobs to those who convert. To be sure, these arguments probably do make a kind of intuitive sense to middle-class urbanites who have observed the coincident increase of foreign missionaries and local churches. And it's true that some pastors have elected to affiliate with international missions or to receive a salary or other funds, which are typically used in order to receive a salary or other funds, which are typically used for church building. However, most churches, including the Peace Tree Church, don't depend on foreign donations. The only external support that church has gotten was a one-time thing of a few $100s from some Koreans who were kind of wandering through Gorkha Bazaar and got sent to her church, and donated just a little bit of money to help put a roof on a structure that had already been built literally by hand by the congregants themselves after their first church was destroyed in the earthquake. I myself don't know anyone who received money after being baptized. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, but I don't know anyone. And so I believe Ian Gibson's assessment that most Nepali converts probably lose more than they gain financially as a result of material losses caused by social ostracism. In any case, a key part of what I'm going to suggest today is that Gorkhali Christianity is very much a Nepali product, fed by converts' sense of themselves as citizens and the expectations created by Nepal's moralizing state. Okay, so now section 2, Christian rhetorics and practices of care. Anthropologists offer an alternate understanding of Christianity's appeal in Nepal. Considering its rate of expansion, there's less scholarship on the topic than one might expect, which I think is probably due in part to many anthropologists' own ambivalences about the relationship of Christianity to what we tend to understand as traditional culture and religion. But what scholarship is there basically agrees that Christianity has benefited from the emergence of new ideologies and socioeconomic forms that have caused breakdowns in social relationships and a resulting sense of dis-ease. This is materialized in a range of health problems. Recognizing then that the vast majority of Christian converts report that they came to the church in hope of relieving an affliction that doctors or traditional healers, Dhamma Chakri, had been unable to cure. And you see different statistics on this, but it's anywhere from 75 to 90% of people say they became Christians. They came to the church in search of healing. These anthropological theories posit Christianity as a kind of functional response to social change and its dislocations. As a report of what converts say brings them to Christianity, this is a fairly reasonable description. Yet as an analysis, it leaves an awful lot unexplained, including what it is about Christianity that speaks so powerfully to people suffering. In the first book-length study of a Christian community in Nepal, anthropologist Ian Gibson fills in these blanks and comes up with the argument that what makes Christianity compelling in Nepal is its attention to suffering and its provision of care. In the city of Bhaktapur, where he worked, rising individualism is perceived to be leading to a breakdown of relationships indexed by decreasing care, which has traditionally been conceived as an effective duty within hierarchically organized kinship networks, the burdens of which I would note, although he doesn't do anything with this, are traditionally disproportionately borne by women. Prior to conversion, quote, the convert will usually feel that others, particularly social intimates from whom they expect love and understanding, are not responding adequately to their suffering. This sense of abandonment and accompanying moral breach increases the sufferer's pain and alienation. Enter then a Christian stranger. Christians are specialists in suffering, Gibson writes, who affirm the pain of people to whom they have no obligations and from whom they ask nothing, but hold out the promise of healing and new community. Quote, while Bhaktapurian Hindus see the growth of Christianity as a symptom of increasing individualism, Christians themselves see their religion as promoting an understanding of care that's better than its Hindu equivalent, because it assumes that care is as much due to those outside one's social group as those who are within it, and in the principle that care for the sick should not be performed for payment, but for the sake of love. A similar understanding of care and its ethical import appears in Nathaniel Roberts' account of Christianity in a Dalit slum on the outskirts of Chennai, India. In the community where Roberts worked, which as in Bhaktapur is primarily female, 80 to 90% of the Christians are women, Christians understand themselves, he says, as people who care. That is, people who recognize other people's vulnerability and feel called to respond to others' suffering and needs simply as part of being human. He notes that this ethic of care is not particular to Christians in his field site. He describes it as a broader slum morality. However, he says, it resonates with Christian rhetorics that stress the intrinsic value of every person, as well as Christian organizational techniques that distribute responsibility for individual welfare across social networks. For his poor Dalit interlocutors, Christianity's universalizing vision of humanity stands as a critical affirmation that they were worthy of care, in contrast to the cruel and willful disregard, he says, that they received from the dominant caste-based society. While neither Gibson nor Roberts move beyond their field sites to theorize more broadly, I'm struck by their arguments about the ethical appeal and social impact of the Christian focus on care, which rings true with what I saw in Gorkha. Yet I also feel like something's missing in these arguments, which I'm going to try to illustrate using feminist theory and attention to affect and observations from my own research. In particular, I ask you to think about a force that's absent in both of these analyses, which is the state, which also appears in my story in the form that it takes for most rural Nepalis, which is, of course, development. For Gibson, Christianity appears as an antidote to Bhaktapurian Hinduism and takes advantage of the breakdown of what he calls the traditional order to challenge social formations based on caste, ethnic, and gender hierarchies. But while he identifies the rise of individualism as a threat to social solidarity, he says little about the forces that put this dynamic in motion, processes that can't be separated from policies and politics, notably 30 years of political and economic liberalization. Similarly, Robert's concern is with the way that Christianity resolves what he calls endogenous moral contradictions. And I have to say that I've learned an awful lot from this book and from his micro-level analysis of how this works. But at the same time, I don't have faith, as to go with the religious rhetoric, in his claim that, quote, the contrivances of modern nation states were of no relevance to the moral and material connections and related notions of the human that Christianity's popularity in the slum depended on. Now, these are not my field sites, and I may be wrong. But I can't help but wonder if the absence of national level politics in these stories might also be conditioned by other factors, including the apparent realities that Christianity is taken to be a religion, and that the vast majority of Christians in both of these places are women. Feminists have pointed to the scholarly tendency to theorize the political economic as if it were an autonomous domain, and to distinguish the public realm from the private, naturalizing false boundaries between complexly imbricated modes of practice, and eclipsing the ways in which women's subjectivities and the shapes of so-called domestic life are in fact shaped by policy and law. Similarly, Assad, Jacob, and others have pointed out how religion is associated with the private sphere, also emotion, in contrast to an imagined, rational, public, secular domain. To be sure, the private of the religious secular is not identical to the private of the family-state opposition, but both conceptual frameworks are profoundly gendered, and together they've led to a general theoretical silence concerning women's religious action and its relationship to states. I've already alluded to the place of Hinduism in Nepal's national imaginary. What I didn't fully explain then is the way that this moralized the idea of development, which has implications for the way that Nepali women think about the state and about Christianity today. From the early 1960s into the 90s, royalist nationalists promoted the idea of Rajdharma, a notion that posited an effective relation between the king and his subjects, suggesting that he, the king, bore the duty of governance out of devotion and concern for his subjects' well-being, and that they, in turn, owed him loyalty and devotion. Deployed this notion of Rajdharma to legitimate the king after he had intervened to overthrow Nepal's first experiment with democracy. This is in the 1950s and 60s. That is, nationalist ideology used the notion of Hindu Dharma to bind subjects to the state. And in fact, King Gyanendra tried to do this again in 2006 as the tide turned against the monarchy in the context of Jan Underland II, much less successfully, as the end of the monarchy in fact makes clear. But the affective structure was there. Since the 1950s then, what this means, development, or bikas as it's known in Nepali, has been promoted as the nation's greatest goal, something that every citizen should adamantly desire. And as I mentioned, it was moralized and deployed as part of the ideological formation development was moralized and deployed as part of this ideological formation by being represented as a gift to his subjects from a loving king. So what this means is that the ethic of care can never be fully separated from the politics of state in Nepal. The next part of my presentation will illustrate this and show how it's impacted the reception of Christian rhetorics and practices in Gorkha. And I've titled this, finally, some ethnography. I'm going to sort of go through some pictures now. I'll be talking about particular people. In order to preserve their anonymity, I'm not going to show you the picture of the person that I'm talking about as I'm talking about them, but I'll give you, sort of as I move along, just pictures of people from the church. So let me begin by quoting an interview with Davy, an active member of the Peace Tree Church, who estimates that her age is around 48. Originally from a village, but now living on the edge of Gorkha Bazaar, Davy joined the church in 2010 after falling into a severe depression. At the beginning of an interview in 2011, I asked her, rather generically, I thought, how she was doing. There's no peace in this country, she immediately replied. There are shortages everywhere. The people now are yearning for peace. Our main concern is where it's gone and how to achieve it. The country has not been able to promulgate a constitution, so we've had no peace until now. Also, there's unhealthy competition between neighbors, and food prices have soared. Everything is expensive. Prices today are double what they were last year. Corrupt people, like politicians, they're doing well. But the people, Janata, are waiting for our turn to benefit. It's very hard to survive in Nepal right now. And this Janata that she used for the people there is, of course, the same Janata as in Prajatantra, the subjects. Later in the conversation, I asked about the upcoming Constituent Assembly elections since the first CA had been dissolved by the Supreme Court at that point after 4 years of stalemate. What party would she vote for? I asked. Vote? Why would I vote? She answered. Whoever I might vote for, all the way up. They don't do any work. People only do things for themselves now. How many people have been killed? How many were lost? How many have nothing now? She asked, referring to the Civil War. And what's happened? Nothing. I won't give my vote to anyone. Why should I give anyone my vote? No one takes care of people like us. Contrast this then to what she says about Christianity. People come to the church to find solutions to their problems through prayer. No one becomes a Christian out of naive interest. One remembers Parmeshwar only after facing pain and problems. Everyone who comes to him does so after becoming ill or developing problems. But Parmeshwar provides health, security, and above all, peace. Now, Devi's own path to Christianity is heartbreaking. Life was actually fairly good to her until 2006. She and her husband ran a meat shop in Gorkha, and together they had 4 children. Her husband had a Belgian patron who wrote to them frequently and sent money on occasion. But life was becoming more expensive. So she explained, because of our growing need for money, my husband went to Kathmandu to open another shop there with our eldest son. He brought his stepbrother with him to educate. And then one night, the stepbrother killed them both. Now I'm alone, struggling to raise these 3 children. At this point, she's weeping, I'm weeping, we're all weeping. She continued then. Earlier, the Belgians helped us, but now they've stopped communicating. Of my 3 children, 2 study in class 7, and the other can't read at all because she's mentally impaired as a result of typhoid fever. Also, my living son doesn't obey me and has even stopped coming home at all. I have 2 pigs, I sell meat, this is how I make my living. My husband had no pension and we don't have any land. Lately, however, I found God. There's peace and well-being in Parmeshwar, and I pray to him in hard times. I had heard about him, that there was peace and healing at church, so I went there. I have found peace and comfort, and I have become a Christian. She used the word biswasi, I've become a believer. God has given me peace. The problems and solutions that Devi points to here, a government that doesn't take care of its people, a society characterized by agonism rather than mutual aid, and a Christian God who provides health and security, which are notably, again, services that were once provided by the state but have been privatized, appeared again and again in my conversations. You can hear Devi's contempt for political leaders who she believes have stopped caring about people like her. Other women told me that it was an especially bitter pill that the Maoists, who they had supported and believed were fighting for people like them, had abandoned their commitment to poor people once they achieved power. Now these women told me the Maoist Supremo lived in a mansion with a swimming pool in Kathmandu, and there was no chance for progress or development because, quote, as soon as one person rises up, other people grab his leg and pull him down. And I really can't stress enough how much hope these women had put into the Maoists during the war, or how they valorized the Maoists' willingness to give up their own lives for the benefit of others, which is kind of like Jesus when you think about it. As Veena, the wife of a soldier in the Nepal army, put it in an interview that I did while the war was still going on, so in 2002. She said, what the Maoists are doing, this is an army, the wife of an officer in the army, or a recruit. What the Maoists are doing is good. They're doing it for us. They aren't fighting for personal benefit. They're fighting, hoping for something for the future of the country. We're involved because if we don't have jobs, we can't feed our kids. But they don't get a salary. They're fighting knowing they may die today or tomorrow. We're fighting for our own self-interest, and they're fighting for the country. Now, the violence of this betrayal by people they had expected to help them, whether Maoists or the state, as well as the virtue of responding to others' needs, can be heard in what converts say about the church. You already heard Devi. Let me now share some excerpts from another interview. Prabhu fled her village during the insurrection when, unable to farm and seeking an income source, her husband, like Venus, joined the army. Alone, this made her the object because her husband was now in the Nepal army of Maoist threats. Alone in town, then, she began to experience problems that no hospital or Dhamma Jackery could cure. She became so depressed, she said, that she would have abandoned her baby to death if somebody hadn't heard the child crying in the sort of ditch that she'd abandoned him in and pulled him out and brought him home. At this point, even non-Christians told her to seek help from the Christian God. And so in desperation, she went to a church. When I arrived, they were singing devotional songs. My body was shivering and my left hand was burning up. There was ringing in my ears all the time. I always felt depressed and angry. But when I heard them singing, the ringing disappeared and the weakness too. I didn't feel sad anymore. I was happy again. My renewal began from that very moment. She attributes this to the healing of the Christian God's care. Whether we're poor, whether we're elderly, orphans, widows, even if we don't know how to speak and we offer him nothing, when we say that we want to come near him, the Lord accepts us. Prabhu, the Lord, this is the language, says come. When we ask him for something, he says take it, no matter that we can't afford to buy roosters or goats to give as offerings. Being a Christian, the Lord will give us what we want. It's written in the Bible in so many places. Don't be afraid. I'm here with you. I will help you. I will hold you with my right hand. Then, speaking in her own voice, she said, Prabhu cares for us. To illustrate this, she offered a story. Her husband had given her 40,000 rupees to pay someone from whom he'd bought a buffalo. But in the distraction of her depression, she lost it. So she took a loan to make that payment, and then other loans to repay that loan, ending up overwhelmed by debt. Living in a place to which she'd fled for the seeming safety of anonymity, her social networks were broken, and she had no money. She stressed several times that it was difficult for her to even feed her kids, that she couldn't even provide tiffin for her hungry children. And I take this as a way of expressing an absolute loss of self-respect and identity, inasmuch as caring for one's children is probably the most critical and symbolically laden task for women like her. This situation was resolved when Chandika, the pastor, recognized her trouble. Chandika gave me the offerings made in church and also managed a loan from the church group, which allowed her to repay her other creditors. There were lactating buffaloes, and we sold the milk, and slowly I managed to repay all the debt. Her favorite psalm, one of the most popular in the church, is one that affirms God's unwavering support. Its lyrics state, there is no God like Yeshu, Jesus. There's no one like you. Even when parents abandon us, you will never abandon us. You will never change. Yeshu will never change. So, while the context of these narratives is certainly social change and associated forms of conflict and insecurity, I'm just going to take the bold step of saying that this really seems like a pretty depoliticized description of the struggles that my interlocutors articulated. And I mean that somewhat sarcastically. I don't think it's such a bold step to say this. In fact, I'd propose that we interpret Gorkhali women's embrace of Christianity as a type of engagement with the neoliberal Nepal state, albeit a critical one, and particularly with its absence. writing about black women and Pentecostalism in Africa and the diaspora, and Pentecostalism is basically the type of Christianity that we're talking about in Nepal. Judith Castleberry and Elizabeth Pritchard write that, quote, a major appeal of Pentecostalism to black women worldwide consists in it being the proximate and preeminent opportunity for these women to engage what Lauren Berlant refers to as undead desires to form a live relation to power. I'm not going to pursue this parallel immediately here, but I find the observation relevant. So to repeat, since the early 90s, Gorkali Nepalis have seen a massive rollback of state care and protection. Services that had previously been provided as part of the development gift have been turned over to the depersonalized machinations of a faceless free market that has left most of them vulnerable in a myriad of ways. My interlocutors don't necessarily link this to the international governmental project that many of us in this room, maybe all of us in this room, would call neoliberalism. For them, the precarity that pervades their own and others' lives is the result of a lack of effective government, not its consequence. And I'm reminded here of Margaret Thatcher's infamous words castigating Britons who expected welfare support. She said, "There's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and families. People must look to themselves first. It's our duty to look after ourselves." And I cite this quote because Thatcher's conception of duty, of individuals to themselves, is so absolutely divergent from my interlocutors' expectations, both concerning political morality, which they see as the obligation of the state to care for them, and also from their own ethics of personhood. I've written elsewhere about the ways that liberal development models conceptualize women's empowerment in ways that assume a developmental subject that imagines herself as an autonomous agent who seeks to pursue her own pleasures, free from social constraints, including gender, and about the ways that this fails to recognize the very different sense of self that characterizes the women I'm writing about, who generally understand themselves as formed in and through relationships, that is mothers, daughters-in-law, wives, and who aspire not to freedom from the commitments and labor that these relations imply, but the ability to fulfill these gendered roles successfully. Almost all of the women I spoke with in Nepal took for granted that hard work and suffering are inevitable if one is to nurture and sustain one's family. And this was the duty of a proper woman for them. In fact, contra Thatcher, they saw it as a sign of selfish immorality to look after themselves only. So in a longer, the written version of this paper, I quote another Gorkali woman from the same village as Chandika, the pastor. Nanu isn't a Christian as far as I know, although she may have since become one. That seems to be the pattern. I haven't seen her in several years. But the feelings that she shared with me in 2001, so it's before the war ended and the monarchy was abolished, echo what her Christian sisters were telling me at that time and what they continue to say today. After the People's Movement in 1990, Nanu told me she'd expected that there would be good facilities in the village, i.e. development, that there would be justice, that working people would be free to do their own work, and that there wouldn't be suppression and exploitation anymore. However, she observed, the opposite has happened. Now the ones with power can do anything. If the king could run the government properly, then these problems could be resolved. Or if the Maoists run the government, there would be no problem of food and clothing for those who do their duty. The government would take care of them. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. The poor are dying on every side. But if peace could be restored, it wouldn't have to be like this. As it turned out, however, although the fighting came to an end, the political, economic, and moral chaos, from their perspective, has continued. So I'm getting close to the end of my time here. So I'm just going to move quickly through a few ideas that I think are relevant, and we can maybe talk about them more in the question and answer. What I've shown you so far might give you the impression that the converts that I've described have simply shifted inherited political expectations about a hierarchically organized social universe where a powerful monarch, indeed a divine monarch, in as much as the king was seen as an embodiment of Vishnu, takes care of his people, and they, the people, in turn recognize their bonds to him and to one another. So you might think that that was just shifted onto a Christian sovereign. And I do think, and that this is the way that they're finding repair is through this relationship. I do think there's some truth in the idea of this dynamic, in as much as my interlocutors consistently describe the Christian God as offering them peace and welfare, the peace and welfare that they see as the duty of a king. But to stop there would be to subscribe to a theory of religion as a kind of functional false consciousness. Opiates, after all, do give a sense of peace and security. It would also suggest that my interlocutors' subjective identities and moral worlds were unaffected by 30-plus years of democratic ideology, and I think both of these things are wrong. So now's where I want you to try to remember the video that I started with, showing the practice and the emotion of Christian prayer. Converts regularly told me that prayer was their favorite part of the services, and that they also prayed when they're alone. I feel light after I pray to God, Prabhupada told me. It feels good to pray in church with so many people, but there are things we're afraid to tell anyone, even our own husbands. I pray for those things on my own. God fulfills what we wish for and listens to us. The first time I attended a church service in Nepal, I was struck, and I really mean blown away, by two things in particular. One was the intensity of affect in the room, which arose during the singing and then peaked in moments of prayer, and you saw some of that. I couldn't remember being in a place where so many people were so forcefully moved. It really viscerally affected me. The other thing that hit me, though, was the very fact of all these women, because as I said, these churches are 75%, 70% female at least, raising their voices at all in this way. As I said, the roots of this project were indirectly laid when I was working as the evaluator of a rural women's literacy project in Gorkha. The goal of this project was to empower rural Nepali women, and a key indicator of that was whether they would speak in the presence of others to express their feelings or to make demands. Now, I know from experience that the colonial developmental stereotype of the silent South Asian woman is exactly that, a stereotype. That the structures and life cycles of women's self-assertion are far more complex than these kinds of theories propose. However, I'd never seen women expressing themselves in Nepal in quite this way. It was a remarkable scene of both autonomy and collectivity, personal expression, and public intimacy. And this is, by the way, actually exactly the way that a friend who's watched Chandika's church grow from across the street describes what he thinks brings Nepali women to Christianity, or Gorkhali women. He said there's nowhere else in society that allows people to come together and express their feelings like that. Everywhere else, the women just have to hold it in, but the church gives them a chance to express themselves, to voice their sorrows and emotions, to cry and be comforted. This feels good to them, that it brings a feeling of peace. So this question of speech and voice is, I think, really important here. In her book, Voicing Subjects, Laura Kunruther suggests that one of the defining features of post-1990 years in Nepal is the rise of a discourse about voice and raising one's voice that establishes it as central to personal and political subjectivity. In this book, she writes, I argue that a political voice associated with democratic participation, consciousness, and agency, and an intimate voice associated with interior feeling, emotional directness, and authentic communication are mutually constitutive, and both are important aspects of modern subjectivities emerging and present in contemporary cognitive. While Kunruther's work was centered in the capital, her insights apply to Gorkha as well. Gorkhali Christian women include indeed all Gorkhalis, I think, have also been exposed to liberal democratic developmental ideologies, including these kinds of incitements to subjectivity mediated by the trope of the voice through public discourse, FM radio programming, and state NGO, INGO-led women's empowerment projects. And if voice is now widely experienced as an index of personhood in Nepal, then we might ask what it's like to be denied a voice, what it feels like to be denied a voice, or to raise it, say by allying with the rebels, but later be ignored. Here I find myself thinking of Jill Stouffer's idea of ethical loneliness. which she describes as the isolation one feels when one has been abandoned by humanity or by those who have power over one's life possibilities. It's a condition undergone by persons who've been unjustly treated and dehumanized by human beings and political structures who emerge from that injustice only to find that the surrounding world will not listen to or cannot properly hear their testimony. Stouffer is a political philosopher who draws heavily on Levinas and Holocaust testimonies, so maybe not the most obvious research for a scholar of South Asia, but she's like Jawahirlal women in seeing the human condition as one of intersubjective reliance. Quote, it's part of the human condition that it's part of the human condition that abandonments and abuses affect us as deeply as they do, she writes. And unlike other theorists of trauma who tend to approach it as an individual psychological state, she connects this inner experience to public policies and ethical expectations, especially of justice. Quote, being abandoned by those who have power to help produces a loneliness more profound than simple isolation. This is why practices of political transition, reconciliation, or recovery should always aim to do more than merely rebuild the formal equality or political autonomy of persons, she writes. If Kamarthur is right then about voice in Nepal, then not having your suffering heard or responded to by political leaders from whom one expects care could indeed be brutal. So it is possible, this would suggest it's possible to suffer from political alienation, not just isolation from caste, kin, and lineage groups. Conversely, Christian prayer might be a particularly effective medium for generating the opposite experience, social identity, subjective life, inasmuch as it consists of raising one's voice and being recognized. And think of Prabhupada, God fulfills what we wish for and listens to us. So where am I going with all this? First, I want to insist on the public political implication of Christian practices of witnessing and care, indeed all practices of witnessing and care, for the Gurkhali women that I work with. Practices of care which are tied to ethical subjectivity, so to being a good woman, a good citizen, or a good leader, are critical to understanding Christianity's appeal in Nepal. And as my interlocutors' words show, they emerge and take on meaning within histories and bodies that need to be analyzed as intersectional sites of power. So state power, caste power, gender power, the international politics of aid, etc., and which should not be separated from politics or practices of the nation state. The growing presence of new Protestant Christians in Nepal illustrates the profound entanglement of religion and politics to the extent that it's possible to even make those distinctions. So the missing part of this analysis for now is the role of affect, which isn't only important for theorizing how voice and recognition are concretized in the healing body. So that is to say, it's not only important for addressing the ethnographic problem of how morality becomes material, but it can also help us to overcome conceptual dichotomies that bedevil the study of religious rhetoric and practice, including popular and scholarly distinctions between the social and the individual, and between the psychological and the material. Religion's presumed placement in the minds of individuals, whether as ideology or as an emotional state, leads many excellent scholars who consider themselves to be concerned with real or material structures to dismiss its potential as a window onto political economic life. Yet, Sarah Ahmed and other feminist theorists have shown that emotions are tied to ethical subjectivities that produce collective identities and secure them in bodies through concrete and biological experiences of affect. The affects that surface in prayer and that lead to this sense of peace and welfare are, to quote Ahmed, not simply within or without, neither public nor private, as it were. They're also neither purely social nor purely discursive, as Yael Navarro Yassin argues in a different context, and I want to gesture to that. With Christianity rising in Nepal and Christians again under threat by the argument that they're not fully Nepali and therefore possibly not deserving of certain full citizenship rights, it's incumbent upon scholars in the democratic public in Nepal to understand the ways that Christian morality and religious identity has been shaped by Nepali history and politics, including gendered expectations for women and cultural policies that have moralized the state. So the voice raised in prayer, which is both public, private, and political, even when this isn't the worshiper's intent, brings believers who have experienced abandonment by other human beings and political structures, those, in Stouffer's words, who have power over one's life possibilities, into powerful healing relationships with the new sovereign, a new community, and to draw on one of Chandika's favorite theological concepts, new life. In this way, we can start to understand how Christian ethics work without having to buy into functionalist theories that would reduce everything to the social and miss the play of power involved in engagements with the divine. Here we can think back to Castleberry and Pritchard's citation of Florent Verlaine and their proposal that Pentecostal worship aims to establish relations to power for Black women whose state, in the context of their discussion, can be described to social death. In any case, when the Nepali Christian women I know turn to the Christian God, they're not turning away from the political or from a native Nepali culture or identity. To the contrary, they're living out effective commitments shaped by gendered ethical norms and by the Nepali nation state. In other words, they're doing their best to make lives for themselves as Nepali women in Nepal today. And I'll just end with this picture of the pastor on her way just before she goes down to conduct the Christmas service at the church in 2018. This is 19 now, so last Christmas. And what you can see is these are her two grandchildren. Her son and daughter-in-law are both working abroad. And so she's got them dressed up in the most nationalist sort of Nepali costumes. And this is not a rhetorical gesture. This is her dressing as the person that she is to go to what is the most important sort of ritual and collective celebration for her as a Christian of the calendar year.